Welcome to In His Grip with Dr. Chuck F. Betters, produced by Mark Inc. Ministries. Each In His Grip message is designed to help turn your hearts toward Jesus and equip you to walk by faith. Let's join Dr. Betters in the sanctuary as he preaches the series, Treasures of Faith.
When God brings these 10 plagues down on Egypt, this is not so much a story about God showing favoritism to one nation as it is a war between a holy God and the gods who were the icons and idols that Egypt worshiped. Now, I believe evangelical Christians need to come together. I believe there are doctrinal distinctives that make us who we are as Presbyterians and Baptists and Methodists and Lutherans and what have you. Whether we hold to an Arminian or Reformed point of view, to a charismatic or non-charismatic point of view, there are doctrinal distinctives that make us who we are. But there are doctrines that we hold in common for which we cannot and must not ever compromise. The inerrancy of this book, the deity of Christ, the virgin birth, these are doctrines that are fundamental to what makes a Christian a Christian. And those are the doctrines that have come under attack. Those are the issues now that the average person sitting in the pew does not know what he believes, because they're getting mixed signals from the pulpit. The evangelical community needs to put off its warfare against one another. The shots we're firing at one another, because the battle is much broader than whether or not I'm a charismatic. Much bigger than whether or not I'm an Arminian. Much more significant than whether or not I'm pre-mill or post-mill or a-mill in my eschatology. There are issues much more grave, much more significant, because there's a war going on here between the forces of Christ and the forces of Antichrist, and the evil one stands back and says to the evangelical, you take shots at each other while pastors marry lesbians. Seems like every year around this time, maybe every 6 months or so, I have to stand up and once again, with a red face, apologize for the denominations that service us. Apologize for the way in which the denominations are treating the scriptures. I'm tired of the church being embarrassed. We fail to see that we're in a war. You see, in Exodus chapter 9, we have a war going on between God and the gods. And here is where the gods are silent. Here is where the gods cannot stand against God. The gods, the icons, the images that Egypt served, they were the target of every one of these plagues. Now, some of the Egyptians left when Israel left. Some Egyptian people actually were part of the Exodus. I don't know how many of you realize that, but some of the actual Egyptian citizens left in the Exodus with Israel. They watched what was happening, they saw what was coming down, and they saw that God truly was God, and that their icons were foolish and vain, empty idols, and they left with Israel. But most of Egypt stayed. Even after the plague of death, they stayed. May I go as far as to suggest to you that even in the organized, visible church today, we have Egypt and we have Israel. We have a visible church that is made up of people who don't even know Christ. But boy, they sure are proud of that picture window that their Aunt Tilly put in. And if you were to walk into their church, their names are probably on plaques adjacent to their pews. And they've been a member of XYZ church for 50-some years, and they're sure proud of that. What's sad is when you sit down and actually talk to these people and say, 50 years ago in that church, would this have been tolerated? They scratch their heads. They say, well, I guess not. Why? Because your denomination or your church has drifted away from the inerrancy of Scripture. How many of you sitting here believe that the Bible is binding in your life? Every book, every word, every chapter is binding in your life. How many of you have watered down the passages that you just don't like in the name of religious tolerance, in the name of compromise? How many of you have brought into question in your own thinking the essential doctrines that make a Christian, and you've thrown them out simply because you see sincerity in others who do not believe that way, and you just can't justify? How could such a good person who is so sincere be so eternally lost? If God were to zip open hell for us right now, you would not find one insincere person there. Not one. They're all sincere. Every single one of them in hell is sincere. They're sincerely wrong, but they're sincere. In fact, when you read the scriptures, one of the things it says is God gives us this illustration of this rich man and Lazarus, this rich man who is cast into hell. Hell is opened up to heaven. Hell sees heaven, and hell begins to pray and scream out that heaven would send a warning to those who are still alive. A guy in hell is praying for his brothers. He didn't pray for them while they were alive, but while he's in hell, he is praying for his brothers so that they would not come to this place. He's sincere. How many of us kind of scratch our heads? Even in the evangelical church, we say, well, maybe there really isn't a hell. I really don't want to believe it. Let me tell you something. I don't want to believe in hell. Everything inside of me screams out, how could a God who is a just and a holy God, a loving and caring God, how could that God take somebody who is sincere as a Muslim, sincere as a Hindu, sincere as, and you name the denomination, you name the cult, how could he take someone who gets up early in the morning and bows to Mecca and is more devoted to his prayer life than I could ever dream to be? How could that God cast that man into hell simply because he doesn't believe Jesus is the Messiah? How could he do that? I don't want to believe in hell. You don't want to believe in hell. Nobody in their right mind wants to believe in hell. But there is a hell to be gained for those who do not know Christ. That's the clear teaching of Scripture. I'd rather it not be there. But I cannot call myself a believer in the gospel and just rip those portions out of the Bible and throw them away simply because they're distasteful to me. Sex outside of marriage is wrong. God has not rescinded the commandment, you shall not commit adultery. He has not made a new code. He has not said, now wait a minute, this is the 90s. We need an updated version of the 10 commandments. Therefore, we are going to modify you shall not commit adultery. We're going to change the rules because you say so. I haven't found any rescissions of that commandment. Have you? It's still wrong to steal. It's still wrong to bear false witness. It's still wrong to commit idolatry. It's still wrong to commit adultery. It is still wrong to break the Sabbath. It is still wrong not to honor your parents. These things are still wrong. God hasn't rescinded it. There is no new moral code out there that has come from God. Now, the new moral code has come from those who in their pulpits and in their pews don't like what they read. So we rip out those pages. Now, God sends plagues, but he sends these plagues specifically to deal with the widespread idolatry that was prevalent in Egypt. Look at chapter 9 of Exodus, beginning with verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, again, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Now, do you notice how God immediately establishes himself as the God of the Hebrews, in contrast to the gods of Egypt? You see, this is a battle. The God of the Hebrews is going to send plagues. He's going to send 10 of them. One after another, that God is going to send plagues to a religious nation. A people who had gods and icons for every conceivable aspect of their social life. They had farming gods, they had sex gods, they had money gods, they had Wall Street gods, they had them all. And the God of the Hebrews sets himself up against the gods of Egypt. One after another, he says, Let my people go so they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock, in your field, on your horses and donkeys, the equivalent of Caterpillar trucks and front-end loaders. I will bring a plague on the financial infrastructure of Egypt. That's what he's saying. On your horses, your donkeys, your camel, your cattle, your sheep, and your goats. You take those livestock out of Egypt's economy crumbles. God is saying the God of the Hebrews is going to set up a battle with the gods of materialism in Egypt. Let my people go so they may worship me. Then he says this, but the Lord will make a distinction. There's that word again. A distinction, meaning that he will miraculously intervene. And he will set up a barrier between the livestock of Israel, that is their camel and their donkeys and their sheep and their horses, and the cattle and donkeys and horses and sheep of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die. God says this is going to be a miracle. There's going to be a plague. It's going to sweep through the land, but there's going to be this wall around Goshen, where Israel lives. There's going to be a wall around their cattle and their infrastructure. But in terms of the Egyptian infrastructure, I am going to make a personal attack against them. Probably anthrax, by the way, a fatal and contagious disease with grave economic consequences. That's why we're so concerned about Saddam Hussein's biological weapons. Anthrax is deadly. And deadly warheads loaded with anthrax will be devastating to the world. We know that. Anthrax was a contagious, fatal disease with grave consequences, and it was a plague that was designed to hit the pocketbook. Now listen to me, what I said earlier. Inside of the visible church, let's talk about ourselves. Let's not talk about this denomination or that denomination. Let's talk about the people sitting here right now. Inside of this visible church right now, probably 1,300 people sitting here in this sanctuary. Hopefully many, many more listening by radio. Out of this visible church that's sitting here, there are two congregations represented. The Egyptians and the Israelites in a spiritual sense, not nationalistic. The Egyptians, the people of the world, the people sold out to the gods of materialism, and the believers who have an appointment to keep one day with Jesus. Now, believing about Jesus is not enough. Knowing about the Christian movement is not enough. Coming to church is not enough. You can come here until you're blue in the face, until you die, and we put your name on a window somewhere. And you can still spend eternity in hell. By the way, we don't put names on windows. We don't put plaques on pews. These pews and these windows do not exist for your glory. They exist for the glory of God. Your name's not going to go on them. This is not called Chuck Better's Hall. This is the sanctuary of God. This is his place. It belongs to him and him alone. The gods were exposed in this plague for what they were. Icons of wood, icons of hay and stubble. Now listen, in Egypt, there was a god that they worshiped. It was a bull god. It was the Apis bull, and it was called Ptah, P-T-A-H. The Egyptians worshiped Ptah. They even had burial sites for these sacred animals. These bulls had to have 28 special physical characteristics to become the offspring of Ptah and to be considered a sacred Apis bull. They worshiped these animals. They also had a cow god. Get this now. The cow god was called Hathor. Hathor was portrayed as a cow suckling the king. So the king is nursing off the cow, giving the king divine nourishment. This icon, I want you to picture this, had a woman's body and a cow's head. Now talk about insulting a woman, there it is. But they worshiped this bull and they worshiped this cow. These bulls and these cows were set up as sacred instruments. These people would actually worship these beasts because they represented significant parts of the infrastructure economically in Egypt. Now, when God hits them with anthrax, the plague hits where it hurts. It hits the pocketbook. And what the Egyptian people had to look at was that Ptah and Hathor were powerless against the God of the Hebrews. They could not stand. They were dropping in droves. They were falling by the wayside. Dead cows and dead bulls were all over the place. Dead camel and dead horses, dead sheep, dead goats were all over the place in Egypt. But in Goshen, none of the animals were dying. Friends, listen to me. There is a God of materialism. There is a demon of materialism. And he's running loose in the church. He's running loose. And those of you sitting here right now who even know Jesus Christ, you've bowed to that cow. You've bowed to that bull. You live for power and money. You live for more power, more money. Now, there is nothing wrong with wealth. There's nothing wrong with investment. There's nothing wrong with providing for your families. There's nothing wrong with being wise. But there is something mighty wrong when the Apis bull becomes your God. The Bible's very clear. Deuteronomy 8:13 and 14 says, you know what money will do? It'll cause you to forget God. It'll cause you to forget him. You know what 1 Timothy 6:9 says? The love of money will open you up to a whole host of powerful temptations that you didn't have before. You know what Proverbs 11:24 says? More money leads to more stinginess. You don't believe that? You ever watch poor people when it comes to giving versus rich people when it comes to giving? Now, that's not a broad brush that applies to everybody. But just let me ask you a question. The more money you have made, have you been sacrificial in your giving as the result of making more money? Or have you held on to more of it? As your income has grown, as you become one of those wonderful baby boomers, you know, where you are now the most powerful segment of society today, you are the most significant demographic group in society today. As your income has risen, what have you done to serve the cause of Christ? Versus the time when you started out in the 60s with your first job, when you were on fire for Christ, when the only thing that mattered to you was whether or not you were going to get to that Friday night Bible study on the campus, where the only thing that mattered to you was whether or not your mother and your father knew the Lord and your neighbor knew the Lord. You boomers know what I'm talking about? When there was an excitement in your faith, an excitement in your prayer life, almost a naivety, almost a simplicity, an innocence of faith. You didn't even know to be scared. You weren't scared because you didn't know to be scared. We served in the inner city of Philadelphia, in the ghetto, for years in the ghetto of Philadelphia. And I can't remember one time that we honestly were short-circuited in ministry because we were scared. Now when I drive through that area, I have to lock my doors. I've become wiser. I'm much wiser now. I'm much more afraid now. I'm afraid I'll get shot. I'm afraid somebody will jump me, but I wasn't afraid then. Why? What's changed? What happens to us as we get older? Why is our faith lessened with age? Why is it that new Christians who are on fire for Christ and don't even know the meaning of the word can't or won't? Why is it that it takes a year or so of exposure to mature Christians for them to become just like us who are, quote, mature, unquote, and walk in faithlessness and despair rather than faith and vigor. They learn it from us. Ecclesiastes 5:19 tells us that although money cannot be destructive necessarily, there are some inherent dangers. Abraham was rich, Isaac was rich, Jacob was rich. God increased them with many goods. The Apostle Paul was rich. Now, he spent most of his life savings on trials and defending himself in court. That's why he knew how to suffer loss as well. But there was a perspective these men had on money, on materialism. You see, life in the Spirit will keep our focus fixed. It'll keep our purpose clear. Those who are keeping step in the Spirit, those who are walking in stride with the Holy Spirit, they won't lose sight of this. They'll read the newspapers in the context of what God's doing, not in the context of what Wall Street is doing. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18 speaks of a concentrated keeping of our lives open toward God. Other things will obscure that concentration, but we can and should never be hurried out of abiding in Him. Never. We need to take a deep breath. We need to look at our lives and ask ourselves whether a life that is bent not on personal gain, but on the extravagance that comes from God, who delights in surprising His people, is what we are made of. You know, when you come to this passage in Exodus 9, actually Exodus, all the plagues, when God brings these 10 plagues down on Egypt, this is not so much a story about God showing favoritism to one nation as it is a war between a holy God and the gods who were the icons and idols that Egypt worshiped. And I believe we're engaged in that very same struggle. I believe what we're facing in the church today is an invisible war between the God of the Bible and the God of this world, between our Christ and Satan. I can't tell you how many times early on in our ministry, 30 years ago, where we didn't know whether we were going to eat the next week, how many times God made miraculous provisions for us. I mean, I'm talking miraculous provisions where, I actually prayed that, I shouldn't tell you this, but I'll tell you now. Just don't tell anybody, all right? There was one time that we did not know where we were going to get money for food. And we did not and would not ask our parents. When we decided to marry, it was our responsibility, not theirs. Now, you may disagree with that. You're wrong, I'm right. That doesn't matter. But there are many times that we wondered whether God was going to provide. And there were times when I'm sitting there writing out that tithe check. I thought, what are you doing? It's tithe or eat. Tithe or eat. Tithe or eat. Many times my wife would yank the tithe check out of my hand and put it into the offering plate, saying, well, end this problem for you right now. She had more spiritual sense at times than I did. Tithe or eat. I remember one time the tithe check was the last money we had. And it was 2 more weeks before we would get paid again. I had no money. I have no money, nothing. I said, kiddingly, Lord, you got to kill somebody this week so I can get a funeral. See, I told you not to tell anybody. I actually said that. I said, Lord, you got to kill somebody so I can get a funeral. In those days, we lived in a community where the local funeral directors would call various pastors. There were 43 pastors in my community. 43. Now, that meant that 1 out of every 43 times I would be called. And usually it was for funerals where nobody had a church attendance anywhere. And I remember, Lord, I don't know how you're going to do this one. We don't have any money. And I got 3 phone calls that week from the same funeral director to conduct 3 funerals for 3 people I did not know. And he paid me $25 for each of those funerals that fed us exactly for the next 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, there were times where we had no Christmas presents to give our kids. I remember I got a call once from a woman whose young son, a mentally retarded boy, was dying in the hospital. He was 18 years old. It was my first experience watching somebody die. I'd never watched anybody die before. And I remember walking into that hospital room, and this young boy was in a coma. For some reason, his eyes were open, but he was not there. His eyes were open, but he wasn't there. And we stayed up with that young boy all night, and then he died. And I did the funeral for that family. It was one of my very first funerals. I didn't even know what to say. I was so scared. I mean, I was 21 years old when this was happening. 21. And I did that funeral and didn't see that family again until one Christmas Eve, there came a knock on our door. And we opened up the door, and there was the mother and the brother and the sister of that young mentally retarded boy. And out there on that street of Philadelphia, on that sidewalk, they had that sidewalk filled with gifts for our daughter Heidi. All kinds of toys. We have movies of those toys. And I'm watching those movies, I'm saying, I remember where those toys came from. All those clothes, those dolls. This couple just opened it up and just poured it out there. I remember once we had another option. Lord, tithe or fix the car? Fix the car, tithe.
Thank you for listening. For the complete sermon, please visit markinc.org and click In His Grip. Join Dr. Chuck F. Betters in the sanctuary from Monday to Thursday on the In His Grip podcast.